Perhaps a few comments and I'll self-introduce. I just put in the chat the link to the American Society for Cybernetics website. Those of you who are not familiar with us, you're welcome to go there. I am Paul Pangaro. I'm the current president. We also have here many other members. Claudia Westerman is the VP. Others are long-term members of the executive committee. This is a roughly monthly series, sometimes called a speaker series, sometimes called a conversation, sometimes called a salon. And I'm thrilled that we have a couple of longtime colleagues, certainly in one case, but deep in both cases, Eryk and Mark. And let me just say a minute's worth. I threatened that already. I'll get out of the way in the moment. I'll introduce, or rather invite Mark to give a self-biography. And he will introduce some of his ideas, and then Eryk will do the same. We'd like to have conversation. We're serious about that. Some on this call would insist that you cannot have conversation through technology, but only face to face. But we're not here to debate that issue today, but rather to do the best we can with what little the pixels afford us. But we are grateful for what they do offer. So we have Mark Sullivan and Eryk Salvaggio. Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Um, so some of you may know this already, but um, artistically, I've been functioning as a composer for 3 or 4 decades and also as a photographer. And although the subject today is generative AI images, as I was preparing, it occurred to me that my work as a composer actually prepared me for diving into more recent developments with generative AI and also for thinking about one of the themes that we want to think about today, which is steering through noisy channels, or just more generally, concepts of noise and how they might relate to thinking and social change and even steering. So, I actually first got involved with noise as a production method in an analog synthesis studio with an old Moog synthesizer, which had a little device that I came to appreciate called a noise generator. And learned how to connect the noise generator to filters and to an amplifier, and I was off and running. However, it soon became clear to me that noise was not the old-fashioned notion of unwanted sound or undesirable sound, but a really complex source. And later on, as I started working my way through various kinds of computer programming, I also discovered that um, noise generation, and in particular random selection techniques applied to noise sources, was a really fascinating way to create sound that departed rather dramatically from traditional note and specification processes like you use to create scores, but it turns out you can actually use sound clouds and noise approaches to even conventional acoustic instruments. Anyhow, to shorten the story a bit, um, about a year and a half ago, I was asked by the director of the museum where I work in a unit called the CoLab Studio, which is the innovation wing within what used to be a natural history museum, to get familiar with the emerging practices related to generative AI, partly because the director thought this was going to be something that the university needed to be able to address critically and was more or less unprepared to do so. So I started investigating some of the platforms, and we brought in an artist, Leah Coleman, as a resident who did a residency called Making AI Art Together Again Responsibly. And Leah was making what I would call digital mashups for multi-projection screens and um, gave a workshop on training data, creating your own models, and so forth, and was very much into sort of a participatory citizens approach to this. She was very critical of most of the AI platforms in existence, and it was a good introduction to various issues in this domain. But as a result of that, I decided also to dive into one of the most widely used platforms, Midjourney. And I'm still interested in alternative platforms and particularly the kind of stuff that Eryk's doing, but as he'll point out, probably too. Um, we're creating sort of different kinds of images. I'm still working partly out of choice with representational images, and I'm also working on Midjourney because I want to be able to engage young people and artists who are working on these platforms in ways that get them to push back against the technology and develop their capacities to be critical of this technology, and also, as you'll probably see, um, to reflect critically on it, which I've also tried to do in my own image generation. So if I could share the screen, I've got a couple of minutes here in which I'd like to show some of the images that came out of trying to push against the biases and the refusal of the Midjourney platform to reveal its own processes in finished work. So I've been investigating ways to get around that and to address issues related to generative AI, diffusion as a method, or the use of noise in generating images, and would like to show you a very small number of images that are related to that. So let's see if I can get this going. There's my screen. However, now I can't see anything related to Zoom, which is not good. Let me try this again. Share. All right, here we go. Is that gonna work? I think so. Is that visible? Yeah. Okay. So this is an image created in Midjourney, and part of the intent here was to sort of jam the background data processing going, including data scraping involved in AI image generation, with the resulting image, partly to prevent the viewer from being able to ignore the fact that the image seen, though it looks representational and quasi-realistic, is coming from data. This is another attempt going a slightly different direction. This was created somewhat improvisationally, but basically I was taking screenshots of the formation of an image from the beginning, which is in the upper left, which is almost completely blurred and not very representational, to the bottom right corner, which is where it wound up. But taking screenshots was the only way I found to grab the intermediate processes, because trying to use a prompt to get it to show the intermediate process was an abject failure. And so I was like, well, I've got a screen capture device. I'll just capture every 10 or 15 seconds and put it together in Photoshop. So that again was an attempt to make a viewer aware of a process that often is uh, left out. You get the finished image, but not the process that led to it. This is another data scraping, uh, data confrontational kind of image. Also, it's looking at the kind of variance that you often get with platforms like Midjourney. These facial images are very closely related variants of one another. So this is back. These are still the series. This is a series which, again, has the data juxtaposed with the representational image, although this is, again, looking at one of the weird characteristics of some of the image generation in Midjourney. It generates clones or near variants very easily, some hundreds of them, and it has a peculiar conceptual affinity with eugenics. And so I have a whole series that's about ostensibly eugenics and clones, but it's also about methods that generate enormous numbers of near variants of a particular model. Um, this is a kind of quasi-satirical humorous version, but all of these faces are more or less created from the same data set with small variations. Um, this is a particular selection of those, but it could be hundreds of images, and I thought it was rather appropriate of our present social moment. This is an image called Face Factory, which is trying to get the viewer to conceptualize the kind of uh, options an image generation program might select from. And they're not usually juxtaposed this way as close with one another. And typically, again, you'd pick one and that would be the resultant image. So this is looking at those intermediate processes. This is just looking at an image of a face and a kind of grid to suggest how an image could be decomposed into some of the noise components that are used reverse to generate an image. Same sort of thing going on here. Intermediate states of a facial portrait. This is called the AI becomes image. It's a glitch from the middle of the process, an attempt to grab something before it becomes a final image, and also application of glitch algorithms to force it to produce dramatic glitches instead of hardly noticeable ones. Similar kind of thing with this, although it's all done in black and white, and is again also, this is part of a series looking at some of the biases in the Midjourney program, such as if you ask for a person walking down a street, you'll almost invariably get a white man in a industrialized country, et cetera, et cetera. So I tried to create some images that also started to look at that. This is an AI image looking at itself on the wall. Um, and actually, there's the third dimension, which is both of them are AI in AI. So it's trying to jam up the levels of reflection for the viewer. Similar thing here, except it's not only looking at the subject of the portrait, but also the environment and sort of background intermediate images juxtaposed with the final image. And that's the end of the slideshow. Thanks for all the help, everybody. And um, I think just quickly in conclusion, since we had this technical glitch, one of the things that interests me is looking at the relationships between noise and steering. And I know Eryk's going to have more to say about this, but the whole issue of steering, as I told Paul, is getting much more interesting to me. I think in some ways I've taken it for granted. And also in looking at the literature, it often focuses on mechanical forms of steering and steering devices as opposed to conceptual cognitive steering, which particularly language is important in. So I think that um, cybernetics has concepts and language that could be crucial in exploring AI and AI technology and AI platforms and finding ways to get agency so that they are more human and less destructive and less impervious and less oriented towards corporate profit making.
Thank
The
you,
end.
Mark. Thank you. And I love coming back to steering. Most of you, but perhaps not all of you, know that cybernetics comes from a Greek word about steering, the art of steering or piloting, and
Mm.
pulling it out to intention is, I think, very, very beautiful and very important. Thank you, Mark. Erica, we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Um, so I'll hop in on a slideshow, present some work and talk over it. Just a minute. And just so it's out of the way, is this full screen? Are you seeing probably
Yes.
like a white border? All right. So thanks for having me. I'm always delighted to talk about my work, and thanks Mark for setting up this conversation. I want to show a couple of pieces that I've made, or in this case, a still, and to talk about why I do it, and to talk a little bit about the systems that we are describing today, which is the generative AI systems, what is the connection between the way an image is produced and the image that I'm trying to produce and showing you. So to start with, I like to start here. This is a recent piece called Swim. And this is a video. It's a 9-minute long video. And there's 3 parts to this video. What you're seeing is a background that is generated by asking a stable diffusion. Actually, in this case, it's Midjourney, my mistake. Asking Midjourney to make a type of image that it cannot make, which is an image of static. And the reason it can't make an image of static is because static is actually what it is designed to remove. So I'll go into this in a little bit, but just to look at this image is a sort of layout of where this conversation is going. That background, that sort of colored swirly patterns, that's noise generated by a machine that can't make a certain type of image, which is digital static. In the front of this, you see this image of a woman. This is a swimmer named Nini Shipley. And this swimmer comes from an actual archive, which is the University of Chicago Film Archive. And it comes from, I believe, the late 1920s. And it is originally a 90-second long clip of this woman swimming. And she has been filed under the category of erotic entertainment because she's a woman and she's swimming. And so at the time, this is the type of thing that you put on at a bachelor party, fairly tame by today's standards. But one of the things that happens over the course of this film, my film, Swim, is that I've slowed her swimming down over so that it's about 9 minutes long. And what I do is slowly show you what the diffusion process, training a diffusion model, looks like as it is applied to data in an archive, which is that image information is removed step by step. Now I'm slowing this down so that over time, what essentially happens is Nini turns into a static figure. And what I'm trying to do is explore this way of dissolving memory, way of dissolving archives until it becomes this noisy, visually noisy space where it then becomes a seed of a generative process. And there's a lot of complexity to that that's worth exploring. So a kind of counteract, act 2 to this piece is something called Because of You. And in this piece, what I've done is taken an image of, well, it's actually not an image. I want to be clear from the outset as I go through this quickly. What I've tried to do is tell the story of Henrietta Lacks, whose cells were taken without her permission. And she died shortly thereafter. It was 1950. She went to a medical exam. They took some of her cells. They used those cells for medical research. And her family didn't know that these cells were used for medical research, but they had a very unique property, which is they kept reproducing. They endlessly generated and regenerated themselves. And this made them extremely useful for testing things like chemotherapy and other forms of research, with no benefit to Henrietta Lacks or her family. And I'm trying to draw this connection between the abstraction of bodies, what's taken from bodies, what the information residue that is left behind when we turn things into specificities of scientific research or analysis. They're severed from that human connection. They're severed from embodiment. But also data is severed from human expression and memory. When we share an image on Facebook and it is reduced into data and simply sort of measured and used to reproduce something in a wall of static, we're losing something about that meaning of that image. And so this piece is about that. It is narrated by my collaborator, Dr. Avijit Ghosh, who speaks with a Bengali accent. And what we did is took a 16-second long sample of him reading a line from the script and fed it to an artificial intelligence voice generating system, which was designed to mimic him. And it mimicked him, but because it was trained on primarily North American training data, his accent was completely removed. And so what we heard was essentially the remnants of his voice that has been blended with this chorus of North American training data. In a way, an erasure with a ghost of his own voice present in the narration, but the specificity of his voice completely stripped away. And so I'm trying to explore this relationship between noise and image in my work. Really quickly, this is a step-by-step, a image being dissolved into noise, where you see slowly, it happens very quickly, but in this case, it's sort of step-by-step. You can see information being taken away, and it's being traced back. So in the middle, you have just pure noise. That's this image on the far left being dissolved, and all the information about that and the way that it can break apart is memorized by the system as a series of paths. And then as you go to the right, it's regenerating something from the memory of other things that are similar to it. And so what you get is a completely different version, a variation on the original. Now, to me, this speaks to something very unique about noise, which is that it is the complete absence of information, but it is also the presence of all possible states of information. You can activate almost infinite paths from noise. And in some ways, this seems like it would be really inspiring and potentially opening up all sort of dissolving of categories and all sorts of dissolving of labels that constrain us. But the problem is that actually what's happening is that that noise is being constrained, and it's being constrained purely by reference to other pre-existing categories and references that have come from things like the internet or archives, or however we have labeled and arranged and organized our information up to the point that the model has been trained. So in some ways, what I'm talking about is possibility and constraint, variability and limits, and how AI comes up against these with the sense of there being potential, but there also being severe constraint on that potential, which I think is informative when we think about human decision making and the art making process. How much time have I got?
Big question.
Well, technically 3 minutes, but
All right.
I don't want to be selfish about it. Take your time.
No, I can do this in 3 minutes. So I want to talk a little bit about residues. And so this is an image of a stereo view image. And this is a real stereo view image. It comes from the Library of Congress. And what we mean when we say a stereo view image is it's one of these things you used to put in front of your face, but 10 inches away from your eyes, and the image would blur and it would give the illusion of depth, an illusion of three-dimensionality. And the way that these stereo view images work is you have a somewhat identical image from the left and the right that are shot at a slightly different angle. But you always have this sort of side-by-side elements, right? The same image, a slight variation of the image side by side, and this is a stereo view image. Now, if I ask Midjourney to generate a stereo view image, here's an example of what I get. Literally, the prompt for Midjourney is just the word stereo view. I'm not asking for tropical. I'm not asking for colonized. I'm not asking for any of this, right? I'm just asking for a stereo view image. But what I am getting, and what I get multiple times, is these palm trees, right? This style of dress from a certain period. And it turns out that the Library of Congress's collection of stereo view images is primarily centered on collections around the occupation and colonization of the Philippines by the United States turn of the century. And this is what lingering in the image. When all I ask for is stereo view, what you get are these aspects. And to the extent that even if I ask for stereo view, it's not even giving me the images side by side the way you would with the expectation of the definition of the media format. You're getting this colonized representation of the Philippines. And in this case, it is, I think, almost a direct reference to this very real image of a girls' school in the Philippines that was set up by the US. So what I'm talking about here really is that when we dissolve things into noise and regenerate variations of them, the categories are still there. The categories still linger in the search terms that we are using and the words that we have associated with certain aspects. That sort of category is still limited, and it's not about infinite possibility. It's actually about constraint and reference. So I think this is really important. And one of the things I'm trying to do with my work is get away from referentiality, getting away from the categories and labels that are assigned in the AI system. And so what I'm doing is asking the machine to generate an image of noise. Because as we saw here, what it's actually trying to do, well, now I've lost it, is take an image of noise and constrain it. add information to an image of noise until it gets to something that matches the description I've asked for, in this case, a person diving. So what happens if I ask it for an image of noise? What does it remove and what does it add? Because it's designed to be a noise reduction system. It's a noise reduction algorithm. And what it turns out to do is reduce noise and introduce noise following patterns that have no reference, which means it's essentially almost improvising, but that's a very strong word, right? What it's doing is actually glitching. It's failing to find patterns that reference anything, but it's then trying to draw new lines in, random lines, until it finds a reference to something, but there's nothing to reference. And as a result, you get these sort of abstract patterns and abstract textures that get generated, because what we're seeing is an artifact of the machine testing out new combinations of pixels in order to get close to something that looks like something, but it can't figure out what it's supposed to look like. And so it's this clumpy, variant texture, in some ways noisy images that come out of it. And I think this is a really important starting point for a conversation around what AI is and isn't, which is that we talk about generative AI, but I think we should more honestly be talking about constraining rather than generating, because what we are trying to do is generate images through constraints by steering through the noise with reference to categories and labels that already exist. So these are the images, and I'll wrap up here. Maybe I'll end with this one because I think it's a good connection to a larger conversation, but this is asking OpenAI's text generation model, ChatGPT, what an image of noise looks like. And it actually can't do it. But what it's done, I think, is still quite interesting. This is the closest image to a representation of noise I've been able to get. But as you can see, it still had to add something. And I just find this a really fascinating image. So that's me. And looking forward to a broader conversation with everyone.
Thank you, Eryk. I just want to make a comment in passing as I pull Mark into the spotlight here, and I'll throw a small bomb and then leave before it explodes. So much to say and so much here, but briefly, I'm looking forward to the retrospective some 10 years from now when each of your work is shown in the same gallery at the same time, when the title of it might be Steering Through Static. I go for the alliteration part. Noise, of course, is part of the story. I had one question for you, Eryk, that I can't resist. When you show the sequence from the diver to the noisy ones to the diver, are the middle ones truly noise? Isn't there some order there from which the later image emerges? It's not pure noise in the middle, is it?
Well, it's noise that is introduced through a specific type of Gaussian distribution pattern. So it follows a certain set of rules, but it does arrive at essentially random static, like random assignment of pixels. But it is random in the sense, it's limited by the sense of random that a computer can generate. The key thing is that there is a model of how that image got to that state, and that model can be reversed, right? That's the model we're talking about, is the model of noise and how it can be reversed. So there's a model, there is sort of a overlayer that knows how this randomness, pseudo-randomness, gets generated back to the image. And that gets sort of collated into all of the divers that have been broken down in a similar way. So there's a number of paths that are learned, but the image that is generated from scratch as a random accumulation of pixels.
So paths is important here. My head is so full of so many different questions. If I'm in the middle, I can't.
And I just want to, sorry, Victor's describing GANs, a generative adversarial network, which is not a diffusion model. We are talking about diffusion models.
If I'm in the middle of that sequence, I can't get anywhere in any image in any universe. I can only get to those that relate to diving. Is that true?
From that image, no. That
Thank you.
image can go into any direction. It has to be steered, though. It has to be prompted.
The middle, I mean the middle one.
Yeah, that middle image.
I'm
That
trying
middle
to.
image is actually starting over the process with a randomly generated line of static that has no reference to anything. It's literally just assigned random color values to a JPEG.
So the middle one is truly random. I had thought that it was
Yes.
on a vector from the side. Thank you very
No,
much.
yeah, sorry, that is confusing in the way that
I'm,
I've laid that out.
I'm channeling Heinz von Forster here, who would insist on clarifying how random the middle ones really are. With
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
I'd like to turn it over to the two of you. Would you mind if I propose, Mark, you ask a question of Eryk's work, and Eryk ask a question of Mark about his work? Could that be a place to go? I don't need to constrain it, but that's one way. I would love to have each of you remark on the others, but other than that, it's over to you.
Fine with me.
Yeah.
So I actually, the question would be, and this goes a little bit to what Paul was just asking. So my understanding is that there's no such thing as pure noise, or at
Hmm.
least we can't demonstrate that it's pure. And
And
you
what
made
does
a
pure
comment
mean?
within the limits of the computer, so
Yeah.
linear congruential algorithm allow a single waveform to function as practical noise or practical randomness. And I don't want to go off into, the weeds on random, not random, noise, not noise, but you also introduce the concept of constraint, which
Mm.
in my work with sound, before even getting into these images, was everything when it came to dealing with um, noise. And so, for instance, in generative sound approaches like what is it called? Granular synthesis, which is based on a theorem from physics by Gabor, and where particles are in a gas, which you can't know where any particular particle is, but you can describe the results of constraints and edge conditions and boundaries. So I'm curious where you would go. You mentioned that maybe we should stop thinking about artificial intelligence and start thinking about constrained noise and so forth. Where could you tease that out a little bit?
Yeah. It's interesting because probably what I would have asked you is about this idea of like the relationship between um sort of the boundaries in making music, right? Especially experimental music, where the boundaries I would say are probably defined at the outset by the person making the thing, right? Are creating the system from which the music emerges. I don't know if you would agree with that, but
Yeah,
in most
actually,
cases,
I think of what I'm doing as composing constraints.
uh-huh. Yeah. So um I think, well, I'll be honest, I'm getting a little lost in the, could you repeat your question? Because I'm lost in
Oh,
the ideas of what you said.
well, maybe it's simpler and more direct to just say, how do you imagine constraints could help pursue the activity of image generation in a way you find desirable?
I mean, I'm primarily interested in that we understand our relationship to what this is producing. Um, I get very frustrated because I see a lot of reference to these machines working the way humans do, and I
Mm,
think that's actually like, who cares if it works the way humans do or not? I don't actually think it does. I don't think anyone really looks at it making images the way that the machine looks at making images. But a key thing is that it is constrained to reference. And I think that this referentiality is something that we can escape. There's this idea that everything's an infinite remix, right? But like that's kind of a scale problem to me. Like you could say anything is a remix in the same way that you could say that everything is any metaphor. So what I'm kind of interested in is this idea of constraints is I think it's I want to push up against this idea of like where the restrictions are and where they come from. Because in human art making, if I'm, which is an unfortunate thing that you have to append to art making with human these days. I don't think we actually should. I don't think we should surrender that. But so in making art, there are these sets of constraints, but you could play with them in all kinds of ways. You could play with constraints. You could fuzz out certain borders. you could sneak things in. If you've ever taught a class and had a syllabus, you know that students could come up with all sorts of ways to creatively interpret your syllabus in order to still get the marks for the assignment, right? There's
Yeah.
all kinds of things that are sort of not necessarily following the step-by-step set of rules that say noise is the space of sort of oftentimes infinite possibility, right? I don't want to put too fine a point on infinite. Let's just say very large range beyond sort of what this image could be. And
Yep.
what it then does is becomes an image based on everything that has come before it. So is that interesting, or is it more interesting to figure out what the system can do when it isn't constrained? And I think that's something we're both interested in.
Yeah.
And that's something I was thinking about with sort of music and generative music, because you come from this experimental music background, and I wondered how the two things compare in your experience as you're working. Like how's your experience working with Gen AI and your experience working with music? How do you find the difference, and where do you sort of bring one into the other?
Yeah, I guess to me they seem very much, pardon the pun or the musical technology term, but very consonant with one another.
Mm,
Um, so before all this generative AI stuff, even a decade or so before, there was a bunch of activity in the realm of music. David Cope is one of the most well-known practitioners who tried to show how you could use AI to generate specific styles like Bach.
mm,
And that bored me to death.
mhm,
Although I found it interesting to look at the methodology, I wasn't interested in style studies that could lead me to create a credible version of Bach. And I find the same thing with a lot of the techniques. You could use Midjourney to generate Ansel Adams photos until you're blue in the face, but who wants to do that?
mhm,
Certainly not me. And so, like what you just suggested is really what drives my interest in both domains, which is how could we describe a system of constraints that could produce something that hasn't had referentiality before. I'm not sure it's unreferential, but it doesn't refer to something already in existence. It creates a new object of reference, which in some ways is singular. And maybe it certainly goes against the idea of normative object, but it's sort of related to one of Brun's old phrases, which was something which hasn't existed yet or is the not yet becoming now.
mm. Yeah. And so I think one of the interesting sort of things that comes out of generative AI is that it is a new type of system that can produce images in a new kind of way. And what we do is use it to produce images that we've been able to see and make before. And I feel like that's actually the source of a lot of the problems around generative AI is that, where is that reference, where are these references coming from?
Yeah,
Who has given this label of photography, right? Or like Ansel Adams, right? Right? The images in the data set, and I've done a lot of deep diving into the training data for various systems, is that there is tons of information that is highly problematic. There's racist stuff in there. There's very misogynistic stuff in there.
absolutely.
The things you talked about, that if you ask for an image of a person walking down the street, it's a white man. If you ask for Mexican, you get sombreros on almost every single person, right? This kind of really over the top
Exactly.
type of stuff is the references that it's making are not even particularly nuanced or subtle or interesting, right? They're actually very
Yeah.
bold, very, uh, you know, lazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Statistical, they're statistical.
they're statistical, right? And
Also,
you're constraining everything by a statistical representation of a data set.
in relation, jumping back just a little bit to sort of cybernetics concepts and the idea of observing yourself, observing,
Mm,
it seems to me that um, it also has some interesting ramifications with work process. And, some of my photography friends are forever carrying on about this is not natural, this is data. And it's like, well, you've been using digital cameras for 20 years now, folk. You
Mhm.
know there's no physical medium in there. I started with film and I know how to develop film, but I also got interested even in the realm of photography and experimental film, like pinholes or, intentional camera movement. And so experimental methodology didn't just pop up with AI. It's been there in experimental approaches to photographic processes. Same thing with deception. Everybody like, oh, deep fakes, and you could do anything. Well, it's like, did you ever hear of Stalin's, getting rid of those figures in the political circles? And so, like, the idea of creating images that are not true to some particular kind of visual reality didn't just start with AI, and it didn't even start with photography. It goes back into the history of painting. So I'm kind of alarmed at the insistence that current methodology is somehow has a veracity that everything else lacks.
Mm. Yeah, there is, I think, there's elements of scale too, though, to it, right? Like the idea that yes, Stalin could make a deep fake back then, but now you've got a Stalin in
Yeah.
every basement, right?
Yeah, right.
And but that actually, the bigger problem with that is not necessarily that everyone can make these images, it's also that everyone can distribute them. So you have to look at this as a system, right? The AI is one module in the sort of social media communication ecosystem. I guess it's not very eco, but it is this system where we're feeding content and taking that content in and amplifying that content. And so we are in this sort of big churn of a
Yeah.
kind of information that oftentimes is not exactly the best type of um, content that we want. And I talk a lot about noise because one of the things that I find really interesting is that now we refer to information as noise, right? When we refer to Twitter, X, whatever we call it now, or we refer to social media, it's this bombardment of information that has made it noisy. It is not the
Yeah.
absence of information, it's too much information. Now, both of those things are sort of simultaneous in these definitions of what noise means. But now, rather than sort of thinking about how do we filter through and think through what information we want and trust and how to find it, we say, well, the system's producing this noise. We're just going to deploy to filter out the noise too. And so you have an algorithm sorting your information input, then using algorithms to produce information input that is learning from the type of information the other algorithm prioritized, right? So, like, if you post a social media post and it's got a lot of blue, the Instagram algorithm is going to amplify that, right? That's just something that's like, this is a real thing. It's like blue skies, blue seas. Also
Yeah.
flesh tones, right? If you're in a revealing bathing suit and you've got a blue sky behind you, you've got Instagram gold. Now, the things that go really viral are then scraped and taken into the training data at a more sort of, they're more valuable, right? So what's produced by the system is then literally almost engineered to sort of be in that system and amplified by that other system. And then you take that and you take the top cream of that crop and you turn that back into training data. So it's this infinite feedback, amplifying feedback loop.
Yeah, my head is spinning with all of that, Eryk. I don't disagree with anything you said. I did want to interject two things. First of all, per an earlier message in the chat, which not everyone follows, please put questions in the chat. Elena has one, and I'd love to come to you in just a minute, Elena. But others should feel free to raise their hand in the Zoom feature if you know it, or simply raise your hand and I'll look for you, or put something in the chat saying you'd like to ask a question. I have to play Heinz von Forst again, even though I'm barely qualified. Noise is being thrown around in a way that is highly non-technical, and the interpretation of something is where it's noisy or not.
Yes.
So just to be a little cautious there, I'm profoundly happy that this is in the American Society for Cybernetics conversation, and that both of you as members of the society and as practicing artists come here. And this is the sort of thing I think we are and we will do more of as time goes on. And I think it does represent both transdisciplinary, transgenerational, and to some extent, maybe more so as time goes on, transcultural ideas. I happen to look terrible in a sombrero, so I'm not going to put one on. I used to have one. But with
Come
that,
on.
I'll get a hat in a minute. Elena, would you be willing to come on screen and ask your question, or shall I simply read it? If you can come off.
Sure, I can come on.
Thank you so much. Great.
I was thinking about contrasting this with the history of photography, where the photographers that we remember now used a mechanical process to show more than the literal image. And so, what I'm curious about is how do these images generated through random processes show more, and what is it that they show more about?
Could you elaborate a little bit the
Well,
phrase more
um,
than a literal image? Because,
I think of, for instance, Julia Margaret Cameron's photography, basically showing more about the Victorian era, or
mm,
Mike Disfarmer's photography showing more about rural Midwestern United States, or perhaps Lee Miller's showing more through her photography, or Max Ernst, and you were kind of led to a, a a different, something that you would not see if you looked at the same, if you saw the same view. You wouldn't come up with that image. You wouldn't come up with that in the interpretation of a Mike Disfarmer or a Diane Arbus. Um, so what I'm wondering about is, how do the AI generated images get to that point of saying more than the literal what you would do mechanically with a photograph with a camera?
cool. Okay, I get it. So I could jump in if, unless you want to jump first, Eryk.
I have thoughts, but go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, I think all of those photographers were doing something very similar to what Eryk described in choosing constraints and suggesting things through the choice of constraints that went beyond what was literally in the chemistry of the photograph. But they were also manipulating our sense of reality. Dorothea Lange was arranging people in the room and taking things out. And so if you look at some of the history of the process of photographers, even Ansel Adams, photographers who were um, creating realistic photographs, you'll find that there's a high degree of construction in those images, which allows them also to address things that go beyond the photograph, like the social context and so forth. And I think it's even more so if you look at people like Jerry Uelsman, who use like 8 enlargers to create what some people would call surrealistic imagery. It's still realistic in many ways, but it's realistic that's kind of contrafactual. You couldn't go out and see it. And it also suggested something that went beyond sort of mere realistic representation of objects in the visual world. And so I guess to conclude, or at least to stop talking a bit, I think it's the choice of constraints within these platforms that allow someone creating a generative AI image to do something that's in the same tradition as what you just alluded to. So, and it's also got to do with going against the grain of the technology and the social environment. So if you look at the galleries of things on Midjourney, um, it's pretty easy to characterize it in a number of different ways and also to get the desire to do something different. So people who are working with the platform doing things that don't just get done all the time over and over again, I think are exploring how to reach what you um, wondered how you could do.
If I
Eryk,
may
I'd like you to,
also,
yeah, go ahead, Eryk, please.
I was just going to say, one of the things I think is also interesting is that we think about these images as AI generated images as if we think about them as photographs, there's a natural inclination to think about them as representing the world somehow. But I think what they actually are infographics. They are data visualizations. They are presenting an image that is constrained by the data set that they are trained on, and it can only show you the types of things that are in that data set. And so what I think is really useful and sort of revealing things about the world that we might not see is not that it can reveal things about the world, but it can reveal things about data and the underlying assumptions of that data. So the work that folks like Mark are doing, or the folks, right, where what you're showing is almost the impossibility of generating a kind of of getting something that isn't a white man in it when you type the word professor, right? You could show that. You could show that by generating those images and showing the biases. And I think that's what we're pointing out. If you think it's you can do a kind of photojournalism where you expose things and assumptions and power through an AI generated image, but you can only do it if the thing you're pointing at is the data itself, because everything in the world is actually filtered out, and the only thing that these models can look at is what's in the data to begin with.
I'm going to ask
To go back just
Go ahead,
quickly,
Mark.
Paul, to the eugenics thing,
Mm.
it would be inhuman to try and create a school of 40 identical looking people of different ages. But you can do that in this, and it does allow you to create a physical, tangible image of one of the consequences of eugenics and sort of various approaches to gene modeling, gene therapy. So I think sometimes this technology makes some things possible that couldn't be done in a non-fictive universe.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Elena.
I like the image of the Mexican is always wearing a sombrero, and that's a good illustration of that bias.
Yeah. Of
Because
course, the models don't know how we feel about a Diane Arbus photo because they don't know the social context behind what we look at and all that we bring. The information is not in the image. The information is in what it triggers in us and our awareness of the social context, which is true of anything that we look at as humans. And the problem with AI, especially generative AI, which to use a technical phrase, doesn't know shit. Anyway, thank you very much. Jerry, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I wanted to add a comment to Alina's question and perhaps a mathematical question for those who are more skilled in that area than I. So Alina, the issue that comes up is the distinction between chemically based photography in which the individual points of the photograph as you view it are the consequences of individual atoms, or actually several atoms, being clumped into a particular point. This is not a high degree of resolution from a mathematical point of view. Sure, there's roughly 10 to the 23rd atoms in a tablespoon of water, but 10 to 23rd is a relatively small number relative to what you can generate mathematically. And so then the question becomes, what is the mathematics that are used behind creating what appears to be a purely random system in the sense of random noise, as illustrated there? And so I would suggest that here the distinction actually has been described at some level or another in a book called Memory Evolutive Systems by Andre Erisman and Paul van Bermersch, but which is a highly categorical mathematical notion of how we cognitize in general, and images, of course, is a subset of cognition in the total. But with that as background, I'm wondering to what extent the reference system that is being retained when it appears to be pure noise, so quote unquote pure noise, is actually just a very small notion of simple spaces, simple three-dimensional spaces described in terms of the parameters that are generated from the original image, so that the reference that remains in what appears pure noise, there is a reference, mathematical reference, that resides within that framework. It's not visualized optically because it's not possible to get that sort of screen density. The screen density is very low relative to such large numbers. So you end up with just this apparent pure noise. Yet there is this reference image there. And so the aspect of it that remains within the shall we say, the algorithm or within the generating system has the same thing that's comparable, and then is remanipulated and then converted to improved filling in the blank points, shall we say, in this extreme reference. Now, I bring this up because of my own work in trying to understand the nature of genetics and the inheritance of information from a chemical perspective. And here, rather than having three-dimensional reference images in the pure noise, in chemistry, you can only have well-defined reference points, that is, individual atoms. And so if you start out with a massive number of atoms, say like the DNA of E. coli has roughly 100 billion atoms in it, which is a fairly large number. Yet from a chemical point of view, the only thing you can get is convergence back. So if you take out, excuse me, I missed a point in logic. If you take out
Jerry, forgive me.
Yeah, this is the last line, Paul. Okay. The convergence that is necessary from chemistry and the genetics involved necessitates that you reconstruct the same DNA structure. And this is then limited by the resolution of the system and the memory of the system. The chemical system memory is very low relative to the mathematical reference system. Sorry it takes so long, Paul, but that's...
Eryk, Mark, any hooks there you'd like to respond to?
Yeah, so that I think part of what I understand is related to why I use the term functional noise. So like in the domain of sound, scientists often define noise as all available frequencies in the human spectrum at the same level of loudness. Now, that's a workable definition that creates a functional notion of noise, but people can't hear every frequency. The number of discrete frequencies within an octave is much greater than what people can perceive. And so differences in pitch go in our perceptual resolution of the physical differences uses a grid that's much less complicated than the actual realm of vibrations that can be measured.
Yes, yes.
So I think we're talking about functional, I don't want to use the term representation, that'll kill everything. Functional notions of noise that enable a particular kind of operation we want to do.
Eryk, any comments before we bring Jeff in? Jeff Kramer?
No, I think I don't have anything to add.
Okay, great. Jeff, what's your question, please?
Hey, so I was really struck by using Henrietta Lacks. I thought that was like a really illustrative example. And I'll use that sort of as a way to ask both of you about sort of the non-consensual aspect of a lot of these systems right now that, for example, Probably that image of Henrietta Lacks herself was not authorized by her estate. She's not receiving compensation for it. We're using it in a way to draw out those biases, and yet we're reproducing those biases while doing it. So I'm wondering if you can both speak a little bit to, where you fall in terms of internal conflict or external conflict. That so many of these systems were built on, just sort of vacuuming up, hoovering up as much data, images, audio, visual components as possible from people that were not compensated or informed, no way to opt out or opt in or any of that. So thank you.
Yeah, if I could take that one. So a couple things. First, the image of Henrietta Lacks is actually not an image of Henrietta Lacks. It is what the AI generates when you ask it for an image of Henrietta Lacks, and it is a film. So you see this image, and it is a video. It's generated video actually, and this video is just sort of swaying. And the thing about it is that if you look closely, you realize like, oh, that looks nothing like Henrietta Lacks. You're only sort of thinking it's Henrietta Lacks because it's introduced in that way. But it is a reproduction of Henrietta Lacks from something in the AI's data. So it identifies her as a Black woman, for example. However, if you look at her style of dress, it's very contemporary. It doesn't look like something Henrietta Lacks would have worn. And there actually aren't that many photographs of Henrietta Lacks. So there's actually not much to generate from. But I am mindful of this idea that actually that's worse, right? Like the idea that Henrietta Lacks is being represented by someone who doesn't look like her, to me, is part of the thing we address in the narrative, that is an extractive portrait of data about Henrietta Lacks. And one of the things that we get into trouble for, and I think I've just resigned myself to that, I will take that heat, is that we are positioning this as saying, well, this is extractive, right? The AI model, from my perspective, it is the model that is being extractive, but the use of that image to tell that story, some people say it's me that's being extractive, right? And I understand that, and it is a question that I am trying to raise. And if that means I have to take the heat for doing something that is perceived as unethical, maybe that's okay if the conversation takes place, right? Because yes, arguably I shouldn't be doing that with an image of not image of Henrietta Lacks, but I did want to tell that story, and I think that the story speaks more to the humanity and treating Henrietta Lacks as a human being by the way we tell that story, and by referencing the fact that it is not her, and that the cells are not her, and that she was a living person, that restores a bit of that connection back. So I am trying to like I am playing with that sort of like extractive elements, but I'm trying to use that to reveal it and to say, actually, there's a human being behind this. And I hope that the viewer of the full work sees what I've done and kind of forgives me for veering into that.
Sure.
But
Also,
yeah,
just to bounce off of that and maybe go to a broader framework for looking at your question, we did want to touch on the social, political, technical systems connected to so-called AI. And the examples you alluded to are definitely of concern to me. And Eryk and I have talked about this. Training methods, non-consensual appropriation. At the same time, there are also some questions about culture and intellectual property. It's not against the law to take photographs of people in the street. You don't
Right.
need their consent to incorporate their visual identity into your work. That in itself is a legal cultural convention. And so I am very much, as an artist, concerned about how these platforms are trained. That's one of the reasons I mentioned Leah Coleman. They're doing workshops on how to do AI responsibly, and also looking at trying to generate public discussions about not just compensation, but how do you credit people? If you're doing a digital mashup that draws on 300,000 digital sources from the internet, how do you credit them? if it's going to take
Yeah.
13 years to read the credits? You can't do Hollywood style credits. It's stupid. And so same thing with BMI, pennies per performance. Does that work for thousands and thousands of contributions? I don't think so. And so I'm drawn to things like, instead of trying to give pennies for contribution, but I do think there should be an opt-out clause for sure. But why not create a fund and have, these companies that are generating tons of profit off of the use of this create a fund so that people whose images have been used can apply for like a $10,000 commission to do a work. Not everybody's going to get 10K, but if people have a reasonable opportunity to take advantage of that, and there's some good going back to the people who allow their work to be used, maybe that would be a reasonable kind of system of giving people credit and giving
Yeah.
something worthwhile for what they've contributed. But I think the main thing is most of the AI companies, and I'm using it to, the Zuckerberg and Altman, they're not interested in transparency. They're not interested in giving the community agency. And so I think that in a way, we're going to have to find a way to leverage this because the companies they're not interested in guardrails. They're not interested in anything that has to do with socially responsible practices brought into being in relation to this phenomenon.
Well, I mean, you're talking about restraint a lot, and how you're serving to restrain the noise or restrain the models in these ways. There's also the sort of meta concern of restraint of the companies through regulation in some way, restraint through lobbying or through, user concerns or things like that. They're spending an awful lot of money, and that buys a lot of goodwill. But, they're also running into these kind of realities that you're talking about and that people are becoming, more and more exposed to. So obviously you're both thinking about these questions and engaging with them. So which is, great to hear. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
So there was
So
a question about aura in the chat. Is that something we could talk about a bit?
go for it. Do you want to retrieve the chat or do you want to just go?
It wasn't too long ago.
I think that might have been me. I was typing fiercely in the chat. Thank you all. This is such a just like fun conversation. I think a couple of us were, wondering in the threads about, this metaphor of like generative image making, if you can call it that, versus like traditional methods of image production. And whether you could compare it to being like a typewriter versus actual like handwritten writing. And for me, I'm curious, about like the kind of Walter Benjamin idea of the aura of the work, right? Like, do you still identify that in generative images, or is that kind of aura kind of lost or obscured just by virtue of the way the technology is built, if that makes sense?
So as I recall Benjamin's thesis, which it's been a while, I admit, but my memory is that he says that photography actually dissolves the aura, and that unlike the painting, of which there's only one object, a photograph can be printed innumerable times, and because of that, the aura is frayed. Now, other people have said it's frayed, but it's reconstituted in a different domain, and I guess that's what I think about this. Um, the sanctity of the object never exists in this unless you go back to the training methods and all of the sort of original operations to get things. But in terms of a final product, there's a woman, Diane Nicolette Gion, for instance, who's mixing what she calls post-photographic image processing and AI generation. She's applying gums and all kinds of physical distortion processes to AI generated images. And the product is a kind of hybrid, which I find really fascinating because in a way she's turning the whole thing inside out. And there's definitely something that I think would be sort of the uniqueness of that physical object that she produces as a result at the end. But that's kind of different than the stock stuff you just get out of a journey.
I think it's a great question, and I think so. If I'm recalling correctly, I think there's this idea of the aura, which is like the camera's presence to an event. The camera, and because it is the light from that event, right? The way that light was shaped is what is written into film, that inscription into film that gives photography its name, right? Inscription by light. That isn't here because there's no light. The AI generated image is a production of light. And so rather than the camera's presence in time and space, what it represents is that object's presence in the data in the network. And the only thing that can be done with it is to dissolve and reassemble a collection of those objects, right? So one of the things that's really interesting about this idea of light is that that's one of the ways you can tell whether an AI made an image or whether it's a photograph, is that the light is oftentimes distributed in uneven ways. And trained photographers who study light and the lighting of a day, the lighting of a room, sometimes can tell actually that is not the way the light would have fallen in that room or in that time of day. So what's happening, and I think the light is useful as a way of thinking about this, is that you have the light of 100 photographs of flowers, right? That is being recombined, and the flower is gone. The flower you get isn't even an image of a flower; it's an image of a hybrid of those 100 flowers. And it's one slice of many, many possible hybrids of the flower. But if you generate enough of them, you get almost this idea of like, what does the average flower look like in this data set? You could compare the sort of similarities. And so I think it's really tempting to look at AI images as images, to listen to AI generated music as music, but actually it's a hypothesis of what music might sound like. Of course, it is also music. Of course, it is also an image, but it is written in a way that is designed to predict what is in the data. What might something in this data set look like, as opposed to making something new. I think it's one of the things I think about that's helpful is to think that an AI image is following the question not of what does it express, but what is plausible. Is this a plausible image? Is this a plausible piece of music, right? That's a very different question. And that results in a very different set of priorities about the things we look at, the things we hear. So that idea of aura, really, it's a diffusion, right? There is no aura anymore because it is just this amalgamation of auras. And maybe there's something interesting in that, but I think it's fundamentally different.
Could also be that, so Benjamin's notion of aura is also connected to the history of the object. And
Right.
I've been thinking a lot like, people are always positing technical perfection will get rid of all these things. And so like what are today's mid-journey images going to look like in the presence of some developments 20, 30 years down the road? And then I think, well, what do we think about Dadaist collage? And what do we think about previous Schwitter's manipulation of sticking tickets into paintings and tin cans and so forth? They haven't really gone the way of, they haven't been eliminated by technical perfection. If anything, they've grown stronger, and they're situated in relationship to the history of incorporating found objects and so forth. And so I think maybe as this evolves and people keep finding ways both to deal with the lack of aura or to create hybrids that reestablish an aura, that might be interesting.
This rolls back a minute or two. And Leslie, please stay in the conversation if this is still relevant to your interest and question. But I wanted to go back to what Eryk said earlier, where we think of these things made by AI as photographs. But Eryk, you stated a preference, which intrigued me a lot, to rather think of them as infographics. That distinction emerged again in this conversation. What is the consequence of shifting a worldview to infographics, and can we get the world to do that?
Shifting the understanding of the image or shifting the image itself. What's your
Go for it. I have no
Okay.
preference.
I
I wanted you to riff further on that.
yeah, I mean, so the problem with it is like you have you've had this data visualizations have been around for a long time, right? They go back to I mean, I go back to the cholera epidemic where we mapped out what was spreadsheets. We put little gray rectangles around where everyone was getting sick in London, and it turned out that if you look at the center of this space that was created, it was a water pump. And that inferred something about the data and the image. The image then reflected back to the world in a way that, you know, had actionable consequences. I think the problem with the data that we have is that it's a really badly collected data set. It's a data set that's collected with no purpose outside of arbitrariness. So the images that we are looking at are essentially a graph of the weights and the biases in the data set around a certain term that we use that we call a prompt, right? So if I say Australian, I get kangaroos and I get men with beards and certain hats, and I get Australian flags, right? That's a kind of data visualization of the concepts that surround this search term. So I find this useful in the sense of a kind of literacy around how these images work. And so if I want to make these images, that's a useful thing to know, right? That I'm exploring this sort of space around the concepts that I'm labeling with my language. In terms of encountering images, it's so hard if they aren't labeled. And if an image is going to fool you, it's going to fool you. And so this type of understanding doesn't offer much in terms of protecting ourselves from being fooled. But I think that it does present some way of understanding things in the sense of saying, well, if I'm going to really think about these images, if I'm going to think about these images critically, I have to think about them as a data visualization or an infographic rather than relying on histories of photography or references to that kind of visual work, even illustration or something like that. There's a different, very different factor in play that we have to distinguish, and we should be careful to distinguish so as not to say these things are photographs. They're very much not photographs. And I think that orients us incorrectly to thinking about them, or at least, you know, there's obviously photography is part of it, right? I don't want to say ignore photography when we talk about these things, but we have to fuse that with this understanding of data and data visualization because it's those two worlds coming together at a single point. At least that's
Also,
my thinking.
it might be different. Earlier on, I used the term fictive, and in a panel I was part of, most of the discussion was about whether the data was being realized in the visualizations or whatever, infographics, in a way that corresponded to the way external reality was perceived by the speakers. So, changing the tables, I asked, well, what about in the case of fairy tales or fiction?
Mhm.
Like you don't have the same standards for looking at how data is being realized. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no scientific way to say this is not a realistic picture of a unicorn. And so I think we need to get away too from photographic has an incredibly strong bias towards realism and verisimilitude, which it inherited from painting. And like if you ask, you know, what is a fairy tale photograph? Well, Yulesman's pretty close. I mean, but typically people prefer to call that surrealism. But like the things he's constructing, the images, even though they're all made from things coming out of everyday reality, are unexperienceable except in his image.
I think you get an interesting point too about like why do we need it to be that? Like why do we need an AI generated image to reference truth?
Exactly.
Or why do we need it to be, why do we, when we talk about artificial intelligence, why do we always compare it to the human mind? Why? If it's such a great technology, why does it need that to bolster it, right? And I
Yeah.
do think it's a great technology in some ways. It's also a bad technology and or problematic
Right.
technology in many ways. But
And
this
at the least we
comparison
can
to the human,
differentiate it, right? So like you don't ask poetry why it's not journalism. And so
Right.
if nothing else, at least we could separate and distinguish when it's trying to be about truth and veracity and objective reality and when it's not trying at all. And there ought to be some ability to keep the two distinct.
Yeah.
We're coming
And
to an end.
someone writes, you know, it doesn't, photographs are not true either, right? They're not true references, obviously. But they are of the world in a way that
Right.
these images are not. So there's actually more possibility than we are allowing ourselves if we limit ourselves to references to photography and illustration, right? So that's, yeah. Sorry, Paul.
I'm waving my hands a bit.
Yes.
We're coming to the end of time. Not everyone can stay. Those who can are welcome to stay a little bit longer, although I don't want to impose more than necessary on our speakers, which we thank profusely. I'm just going to put my email in the chat if anyone is not on the mailing list and would like to be for these events. They tend to happen monthly, except in months of heavier holidays, at least North American-centric holidays, shall we say. But I want to thank our speakers, thank Matthias and Adler of ASC for helping arrange things. And again, we'll continue a bit longer to the limits of patience of our colleagues here. Would you like, gentlemen, would you like to make some final so-called comments and then see where we might end? Any thoughts on what has gone through this conversation and what you might want to circle back to?
Well, in a sort of self-reflective way, I just think that this conversation to me is exactly what needs to happen more.
What is it
In
about
terms
it that has to happen more?
having a discussion about how to gain transparency and agency in relation to the production of these images, how to create a social fabric in which accountability and transparency are possible, how to put pressure on those who can, you know, generate platforms to do it responsibly in conjunction with communities, all the way from Stephanie Dinkins' AI Assembly to what Eryk is doing with, you know, pushing against the platform and the technology, et cetera. This is what I think is the core of what I would call a kind of critical literacy with regard to these platforms. So I'm grateful.
Thank you, Mark. Eryk?
I think those are great closing remarks. And I'm just happy that it's for the conversation. Thank you, Mark, also for being so thoughtful.
Perhaps that's a logical moment. Thanks to everyone for coming. Again, you can reach us in various ways. Eryk has put his website link in the chat. You can always find me online as well. Thanks to everyone, especially Eryk and Mark. Very wonderful. To be continued.
Thanks.
All the best, everyone.
Thanks. So long, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.